I have said many, many times, I think the left is bad at foreign policy on this channel. And it's not just me that says this. I really do agree. And it was sort of Dylan Burns who made me realize how bad the left really is when it comes to foreign policy. And every single time when I go looking for stories for Geoscope, where we're looking at what are we going to sort of talk about this week, what are sort of the the uncovered sort of stories in the world that aren't maybe that making the news here or are going to have an impact to us in the UK, very, very, very rarely does that sort of initial news source that I sort of sort of get that sort of information from a left-wing source. Very more often than not, it comes from right wingers, and this I think is a larger criticism that the left does fail on. That I think the left doesn't talk about business a lot. And yet businesses are hugely important to an economy. The left will talk till the cows come home about workers' rights, which, again, absolutely fine. I'm 100% on board with that. But what about businesses? And I think this is just the left just cedes the ground to the right, where if they did start to engage in these things, if they did start to talk about these things, then maybe they could also win votes from that people who do perceive that to be a important topic and an area of discussion. But of course, we're not talking about that today. What we are talking about is the idea of appeasement, because we have seen since the very beginning of this war in Ukraine, this whole idea of, if you may remember right at the beginning, there was this idea that Putin had committed an error in invading Ukraine. He had underestimated the Ukrainians, their resolve, their willingness to fight, and that what he really needed, because Putin really didn't want to fight this war, he needed an off-ramp. And it was, how can we maybe give him this off-ramp to sort of, stop him from doing this? And there were a lot of people saying this, and it wasn't really until you got the UK behind this, Poland was really behind this sort of initially, the Baltic States were really behind this, because they understood what those consequences would mean. But you've still got countries like Germany and France who are sort of not that committed to really, put it this way, they want Putin to be defeated and to sort of give Ukraine a victory, but they don't want the Ukraine, well, at least they don't want, shall we say, Putin to have that big a defeat, so that at least he can sort of continue in power and thus not destabilize Russia. And I think we're getting to that point now. And to be honest, we're well beyond that point. Well beyond that point where this as an idea should even be contemplated. And I think these types of people themselves need to be, I think, also taken to task, because as we as sort of not only we've discussed, but as we've seen in the past, what then happens to these areas that you would have to give up? Because some of the places that Putin has claimed, he's not even fully in control of. Do we give him those territories as well? And then you've got to think about the economics of these areas now that Putin has access to all these new resources that he now has access to. As one of the things that was very often pointed out in this war, you have one of the world's biggest grain producers invading, I think, the world's 5th largest, grain producer, I think Ukraine was at that time. Putin, at that moment, Russia becomes a magnitude bigger, a magnitude. And there's a lot of people talking about, well, now that Putin has control of all this grain and all that grain resources, does he now then start using that like Putin has used in the past, um, oil and gas, to try and influence the Baltic states, Poland, Finland? We've seen him do this. What's to stop him in the future using grain, something that we all need to, eat, to try and influence, not just countries here in Europe, but as we've seen, countries in Africa? Something that, we need to sort of really think about as an actual concern. And then you've got to think about the human cost of what that is, because there are going to be a lot of Ukrainians who then basically live under not only Russian dictatorial rule, but under Russian military rule. You are going to see a very, very big movement of refugees, far bigger than we've seen in 2022 from these areas. Not only that, in terms of human cost, we already know it's happening. It doesn't tend to get talked about a lot because obviously Russia's trying to cover up these news stories, but we know it happens, that there is a guerrilla operation behind the lines in sort of these Ukrainian occupied areas where the Ukrainians are fighting back. That's not going to stop either, because they're not going to stop fighting to rid themselves of Russian occupation. Are we going to commit to supporting them afterwards as well? And then, of course, if you appease Putin, what then does this message send? You've got the Baltic states in particular very, very worried about this, because they too have very big sort of Russian speaking communities. Again, if you go to Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, you're more likely to hear, Russian spoken than the current native language. Well, because of, should we say, previous Russian, occupations that they've suffered before they finally gained their freedoms. And they've gone through a lot to try and re-encourage the use of their language in their own, home countries. But there are still large communities that speak predominantly Russian. What's Vladimir Putin to say, I'm going to sort of come and take these, liberate these poor oppressed Russian speaking populations? Because remember, first Russia tried to take these cities by subversion in 2014, which is what resulted in the civil war in the Donbass. And of course, Russia heavily funded the sort of rebels, and we'll call them rebels in air quotes, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they weren't at all from the very beginning. What's to stop him maybe doing that? And then it raises the question of, does NATO get involved? Does NATO pull back? What happens in that regard if we see something similar happen to those countries? You know, it's it's a very, very dangerous time, and I think more and more ever now we really, really need to be pushing to send Ukraine the weapons, and not only just the weapons, but the money it needs to sort of win this war. And I think we have to go, well, tell you what, if Putin loses and Russia gets destabilized, well, that's the consequence we're going to have to live with. But what's the better outcome? Like, if Ukraine wins and Russia gets destabilized, what's the worst that could happen from that? Well, Russia gets destabilized, probably devolves into a lot of maybe independent, maybe even separate countries at this point. We don't know. Again, it will have sort of consequences, and it will be sort of a foreign political issue. At the end of the day, it's not going to be I think, have bigger consequences. Whereas if you let Putin win and he takes the territory, this sends, as we've said before, a message not only just to Putin that he can do this and get away with this, potentially in other countries, of course, more worryingly, NATO countries, of course, but this sends a message to people like in Venezuela, where you currently have troops staring at each other across the border, not knowing whether, Venezuela is going to come in and annex a very large section of Guyana. We don't know that. We don't know if this is going to send a message to sort of Rwanda, and they're going to sort of go into the Democratic Republic of Congo. That could be a thing, and ultimately, remember, Russia's going to end up supporting one of those two through Wagner fighters. And again, Ethiopia, Eritrea, also another potential sort of conflict zone that would have this. China and of course Taiwan, another point of this. So to me, I am always pretty much on the side of Ukraine should win, but there are going to be consequences. Most probably that there's going to be probably a lot of destabilization in Russia. And I think at that point, that's probably the preferable outcome, to be honest. I think I would prefer that outcome rather than either a Russian victory or appeasement of Russia. And I think that's now where we sort of have to talk about, because we have seen in a number of wars that you have to eventually think what the peace looks like, and of course what the potential options for a future peace. And I've said before, I think we need to give them the weapons, the money they need, so that Ukraine has a far bigger option on its table, because we know that Russia is prepared to fight until 2025. They have publicly said that on their own TV networks, that we must carry out this war until 2025. Why 2025? Well, first of all, you've got the US elections, and you're going to have a lot of elections across Europe as well. And they are hoping that the Western solidarity on Ukraine starts to fracture. That is their hope, and that by 2025 they can essentially pull victory from the jaws of defeat. That is what they are hoping for now, and it is important more than ever that we send messages to our governments, to sort of future governments, that we need to support these people, that we need to support Ukraine, and that these questions get seriously asked about your elected politicians. Do you support sending supporting Ukraine? Do you want to send keep on sending weapons and armor? And those who don't should be brought to task. If you know someone if you are in Europe and you're going to go to the polls and there is a candidate who does not support Ukraine, do not be afraid to ask them, why don't you support Ukraine? And are you in Putin's pocket? Make it very clear that by not supporting Ukraine, they are putting themselves in Putin's pocket, and watch them squirt. So, well, again, like I say, next year is going to be, I think, a very defining point of war in this. Very defining. And it is going to come down to the continued solidarity of the West. So, as always, thank you very much, of course, for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.